Keith, as someone sometimes been fairly critical of you, he was not too happy when you accepted a knighthood, was he?
No, I mean, he's not a happy person.
I was surprised, actually, more than whether I was happy or unhappy. Here's a guy who went to the London School of Economics, for Christ's sake. You know, I mean, this is like not one for the hierarchy, but I thought he should hang out for a period.
Keith Richards didn't shout. He didn't storm out. He didn't call Mick Jagger and start a fight. He did something far more dangerous. He laughed. When the news broke that Mick had accepted a royal title, the reaction wasn't a public meltdown. It was silence followed by sarcasm, sharp enough to cut through decades of friendship, music, and shared rebellion. In that moment, something invisible snapped. Because this wasn't just about a medal. It wasn't about ceremony. It was about identity. For years, the Rolling Stones had built their image on defiance, anti-system, anti-authority, anti-everything the establishment represented. And now, the band's frontman was kneeling before the very institution they once mocked. To Mick, it was recognition. To Keith, it was surrender. What makes this story unsettling isn't that they disagreed, it's that they never resolved it. No dramatic breakup, no final argument. Just a line crossed and never uncrossed. This is the story of a decision that didn't break the Rolling Stones, but quietly rewired the relationship at their core. And it begins long before the title was ever offered, back when Mick and Keith were already fighting over something much bigger than fame. Before we continue, if you love the stories of Mick Jagger and Rolling Stones and want to help keep his legacy alive, subscribe to this channel, like, and share. From the outside, Mick and Keith always looked inseparable, songwriting partners, brothers in rebellion, two faces of the same revolution. But underneath, they were built on opposite instincts. Mick was a strategist. He thought in decades, not nights. He understood power, optics, survival. Even in the early years, he was already asking how far the band could go and how long it could last. Control mattered to him, even when chaos was part of the image. Keith was different. For him, rock wasn't a career path, it was a stance, a refusal, something that only worked if it stayed dangerous and uncomfortable. The moment it blended in, it lost its soul. That tension worked until it didn't. The Stones thrived because those two forces pushed against each other. Mick sharpened the edge. Keith made sure it never became polite. But that balance depended on unspoken trust, on the belief that no matter how far they drifted stylistically, they were still standing on the same side of the line. And that line was simple. You don't join the system you built your career resisting. They never wrote it down. They never argued it out. It was just understood. Until one day, it wasn't. Because when Mick looked at the future, he saw legacy. When Keith looked at it, he saw a trap. And sooner or later, one of them was going to choose. For Keith Richards, the British establishment wasn't abstract. It was a symbol of control, hierarchy, and permission. Everything rock music was supposed to challenge. The Rolling Stones didn't just play loud music, they represented disobedience. Their lyrics, their image, their scandals, all of it pushed against the idea that artists should behave, conform, or be grateful for approval. That's why the idea of official recognition mattered so much. A royal title isn't just an honor, it's an invitation into the system. A quiet agreement that says, you're no longer a problem. For Mick, that line wasn't so clear. He believed art could outgrow its rebellion, that you could accept recognition without losing credibility, that maturity didn't mean betrayal. Keith didn't see nuance, he saw contradiction. To him, accepting a title from the same institution the Stones had mocked felt like rewriting history, turning rebellion into decoration, turning danger into heritage. And this wasn't a theoretical argument, it was personal. Because if Mick accepted the title, it wasn't just Mick speaking, it was the face of the Rolling Stones, redefining what the band stood for, without asking permission from the man who helped build it. Keith didn't confront him, not yet. But once that invitation existed, the outcome was already locked in. And when Mick finally made his choice, Keith realized something chilling. This wasn't a misunderstanding, it was a decision. When Mick Jagger accepted the title, it wasn't impulsive, it wasn't accidental, and it definitely wasn't naive. He knew exactly what it meant. Mick had always understood symbolism. He understood headlines. He understood how history gets written. And in his mind, this wasn't selling out, it was claiming space. Proof that the Rolling Stones weren't just a cultural disturbance anymore, they were history. He didn't see a contradiction. he saw evolution. What made the decision explosive wasn't the acceptance itself, it was how it happened. Mick didn't call Keith to debate it. He didn't ask for approval. He didn't frame it as a band issue. He treated it as a personal honor separate from the music, separate from the image they had built together. That separation is where the damage began. Because to Keith, this wasn't about protocol, it was about loyalty, about whether some things were still shared or if Mick had quietly moved on. Keith found out the same way everyone else did, through the media, through headlines, through the sudden realization that the band's identity had shifted without his consent. He didn't explode, he didn't demand explanations. He laughed. And in that laugh was everything Mick didn't want to hear. Because when someone stops arguing, it usually means the argument is over and something else has taken its place. And from that moment on, nothing between them felt the same. Keith Richards didn't confront Mick Jagger behind closed doors. That's the part most people miss. There was no explosive argument, no shouting match, no dramatic ultimatum. Instead, Keith chose something colder: distance. And distance, when it's intentional, speaks louder than anger. For a while, he said nothing. Interviews came and went, the title was mentioned. Keith smiled, shrugged, deflected. To the outside world, it looked like acceptance, or at least indifference. But then the jokes started. Not direct attacks, not accusations, just sharp remarks disguised as humor. Comments about rock stars and royalty not mixing. About rebellion losing its edge once it starts wearing medals. Each line delivered casually but aimed precisely. Keith never said Mick's name when he criticized the idea. He didn't have to. That restraint made the message more brutal, because sarcasm carries implication, and implication leaves no room for defense. Mick, on the other hand, stayed composed. Publicly, he brushed off the tension, treated it like a misunderstanding blown out of proportion, but those close to the band noticed something shift. Conversations grew shorter. Interviews felt colder. The easy chemistry that once defined them became controlled and careful. The fight wasn't loud. That's what made it dangerous. Because unresolved conflict doesn't burn out. It hardens. And from that point on, every shared moment carried something unspoken, something neither of them was willing to name. The Rolling Stones didn't split. Tours continued. Albums were made. On the surface, everything worked. But something fundamental had changed. Keith and Mick still shared stages, microphones, and history, yet the space between them felt different. Conversations were polite, professional, almost formal. The spontaneity that once fueled their partnership became measured. This wasn't a breakup, it was worse. Because breakups end arguments, this one froze them. Inside the band, no one addressed it directly. There was an unspoken agreement not to push too hard, not to reopen something that clearly hadn't healed. Silence became the glue holding things together. Fans noticed first. Interviews felt tense. Jokes didn't land the same way. When asked about the title, Mick offered clean, controlled answers. When Keith spoke, his tone shifted subtle but unmistakable. Humor edged with resentment. Pride mixed with disappointment. What made it unsettling was how normal it all looked. There was no scandal headline, no official statement, just a quiet acknowledgement that something had cracked, and no one planned to fix it. The irony was impossible to ignore. A band built on chaos had become disciplined enough to hide its deepest conflict, and in doing so, they confirmed it was real. Because when people stop fighting, it's often not because they've made peace, but because they've accepted distance. And that distance only grew as the world reacted. Once the story was out, it stopped belonging to the band. Fans divided almost instantly. Some defended Mick. They saw the title as long overdue recognition, proof that rock music had finally earned its place in cultural history. To them, refusing the honor would have been childish, a performance of rebellion long past its expiration date. Others stood firmly with Keith. They argued that the entire point of the Rolling Stones was opposition, that once you accept validation from the system, the music loses its teeth. That rebellion isn't something you retire from, it's something you either live or abandon. Online forums, interviews, documentaries, the debate never cooled. And every time Keith revisited the subject, even lightly, it reignited. His tone never softened. His words never fully retreated. Mick, meanwhile, never apologized, never reframed the choice as a mistake. He moved forward, convinced that history would side with him. That contrast fueled the argument even more. Because this wasn't just about a title anymore, it was about identity. about what rock music was allowed to become as it aged. And somewhere inside that debate was a deeper question fans couldn't ignore. If the Rolling Stones themselves couldn't agree on where the line was, had it already been crossed? Time passed. Albums came and went. Tours blurred together. And yet, one thing never changed. Keith never walked it back. Years after the title was accepted, journalists still tried to soften the story for him. They gave him openings, chances to downplay it, opportunities to say it was ancient history. He never took them. Sometimes he smiled, sometimes he joked, sometimes he brushed it off with a casual line that sounded harmless on the surface. But the message underneath stayed the same. Disapproval, disbelief, distance. What made this refusal powerful wasn't anger. It was consistency. Keith didn't need to repeat himself loudly because the decision itself never changed. Mick didn't undo it. The title didn't disappear. And so, in Keith's mind, there was nothing to forgive. Forgiveness implies regret, and regret never came. For Keith, the issue wasn't personal resentment, it was principle. He believed that once you cross certain lines, the act speaks forever. You can move on, you can coexist, but you can't pretend it didn't happen. That's why the wound never closed. Not because Keith wanted revenge, but because he refused to rewrite his own beliefs to make peace easier. Silence became his way of keeping the line visible. And sometimes, refusing to forget is louder than any argument. This conflict didn't weaken the Rolling Stones. It explained them. For decades, people wondered how the band survived when so many others collapsed under ego and excess. The answer wasn't unity, it was tension. Controlled, unresolved tension. Mick and Keith didn't succeed because they agreed. They succeeded because they never fully surrendered to each other's worldview. One pushed forward, the other pushed back. And somewhere in that friction, the music stayed alive. The title incident didn't create the divide, it exposed it. Mick represented evolution, adaptation, the belief that survival required negotiation with the world as it changed. Keith represented resistance, the idea that some values lose, meaning the moment you compromise them. Neither was entirely right, neither was entirely wrong. That's the uncomfortable truth. The Stones endured because both instincts were present and neither one ever fully won. The knighthood didn't end the band because it didn't destroy that balance. It simply made it visible. What looked like betrayal to one looked like growth to the other. And the fact that they never resolved it became part of the band's identity. A reminder that real partnerships don't always end in agreement. Sometimes, they survive on mutual refusal to surrender completely. And that might be the most rock and roll outcome of all. Mick Jagger never gave the title back. Keith Richards never stopped judging the decision. And in that standoff lies the real ending of this story. There was no final argument, no reconciliation, no dramatic confession years later. Just two men standing on opposite sides of a line, neither would step back across. Mick moved forward, confident that history would frame the moment as maturity. Keith stayed where he was, convinced that some symbols matter more than comfort. They kept playing together, kept sharing stages, kept carrying the weight of decades. But the innocence of shared rebellion was gone. And maybe that's the point. The Rolling Stones didn't survive because they solved their conflicts. They survived because they learned to live with them, to carry disagreement without letting it turn into collapse. This wasn't a story about a title. It was about what happens when identity outlives youth, when rebellion meets legacy, when two people who built something together no longer agree on what it should mean. Some lines, once crossed, don't explode relationships. They simply redefine them. And that quiet shift can last a lifetime. In the end, this was never really about a title. It was about time. About what happens when rebellion survives long enough to become history. When the thing you fought against starts calling you back not as an enemy, but as a symbol. Mick accepted that moment. Keith rejected it. And neither of them ever moved from their position. That's why this story still feels unresolved. Not because there was no answer, but because there were two. And both made sense, depending on who you are and what you believe rock music is supposed to stand for. Mick chose legacy, Keith chose defiance. One looked forward, the other refused to let go of the past. And the Rolling Stones lived in the space between them. Maybe that tension is why the band never collapsed, or maybe it's why something was quietly lost along the way. That's the question no documentary can settle for you. Because eventually, every artist faces the same choice. Do you grow with the world or stand against it, no matter the cost? And whatever answer you choose says more about you than it does about them. If this story made you question what rock rebellion really means, hit like. It helps this channel reach more people who care about these stories. If you side with Mick, or if you side with Keith, drop a comment and say why. I read every one. And if you want more untold stories where music, ego, and identity collide, subscribe to the channel. Some lines in music history aren't meant to be erased. They're meant to be debated.